Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I always knew I was never meant to live in a place where someone else told me what color my front door could be. Growing up in the suburbs, I had a front row seat to the mind-numbing pettiness of an HOA. A neighborhood where every house looked like a copy of the one next to it, just in slightly different shades of beige. A place where neighbors didn't actually talk to each other, just nodded in polite acknowledgement before scurrying inside. It wasn't a bad place to live, just sterile, lifeless, controlled. When I was a kid, I remember getting grounded because my dad forgot to bring in the trash bins on time, and the HOA left us a fine of $50 because the garbage cans were out 5 minutes past pickup. My father fumed, tossing the notice on the counter like it was a traffic ticket. That was my first introduction to the absurdity of it all. Later, I found out that one of our neighbors got fined because they had a garden hose that wasn't rolled up the approved way. Another woman got a violation notice because her mailbox was slightly darker than the others on the street. It was ridiculous. I dreamed of escaping from it all. I didn't want to live in a place where someone with a clipboard and a superiority complex decided what I could and couldn't do with my own home. I wanted space, real space, not the tiny square of grass fenced in by vinyl that passed as a backyard in my neighborhood. I wanted land. That longing started the first time I visited my grandfather's farm. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old farmhouse with creaky wooden floors and a barn that smelled like hay and hard work. There was no perfectly trimmed lawn, no identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers, no soulless HOA letters taped to the door. There was just open sky, rolling fields, and the kind of peace you couldn't find anywhere near a cul-de-sac. I remember sitting on the porch with my grandfather, watching the sunset stretch across the horizon in brilliant oranges and purples. At night, the stars came out in a way I had never seen before. Back home, they were barely visible, swallowed up by the glow of streetlights and the city's endless hum. But out there, it was like someone had spilled a bag of diamonds across the sky. I loved it. When I was a kid, I would spend summers there running barefoot through the fields, climbing trees, and getting covered in mud. I helped fix fences, fed the chickens, and even learned how to milk a cow once. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. And the best part? No one told us what we could or couldn't do. But visiting the farm was one thing. Living there was another. My parents were practical people. My dad worked in insurance, and my mom handled bookkeeping. Everything about our lives followed a predictable pattern: school, homework, dinner, bed, rinse, and repeat. There was no room for what-ifs or maybe one days. The path was clear: go to college, get a degree, get a stable job, buy a house, and live like everyone else. So that's what I did. I went to business school not because I loved it, but because it seemed like the safest option. I graduated, got an office job, and moved into a tiny apartment in the city. It was fine. The paycheck covered the bills. I had a coffee shop downstairs, a gym within walking distance, and a grocery store around the corner. Everything was convenient, everything was easy, and yet I felt trapped. My entire life was confined to a concrete box. I woke up to the sound of traffic instead of birds. I commuted in crowded subway cars, squeezed between strangers who looked just as exhausted as I felt. I worked in a cubicle, staring at spreadsheets all day, pretending to care about numbers that meant nothing to me. Then I went home, microwaved dinner, and repeated the cycle the next day. I hated it. I started reading books about people who had done what I wanted to do, people who left the city behind to live off the land. I devoured memoirs about homesteading, about people who had built cabins with their bare hands, who farmed, who worked the land, and lived freely. These weren't just fantasy stories to me. They were proof that it could be done. So I started planning. I created a folder on my computer called Escape Plan. Every extra dollar I had went into a separate savings account. No vacations, no expensive nights out, just a relentless focus on one goal: buy land. I scrolled through real estate listings daily, searching for the perfect place, something rural, something quiet, something far, far away from anything that resembled an HOA. My friends thought I was joking. What are you gonna do out there? Talk to cows. Dude, you don't even know how to build a bookshelf, let alone a farm. I ignored them. They didn't get it. The city was suffocating me. Every high-rise, every honking car, every crowded sidewalk felt like a cage. I needed out. Then one day, I found it. The listing was simple. Farmhouse, 3 bedrooms, barn, 10 acres, needs work. I clicked on the photos. The house was old but still standing strong. The barn was weathered but solid. The land stretched out in every direction, wild and uncontained. It wasn't much, but it was perfect. And most importantly, it wasn't an HOA. I didn't even hesitate. I scheduled a visit, drove out to see it in person, and the second I stepped onto that land, I knew this was it. This was freedom. I bought it. Signing the papers was the best feeling in the world. For the first time, I owned something that was truly mine. There were no neighbors to report me for leaving my trash bins out too long, no one to tell me how I had to mow my lawn, no letters from a board of strangers dictating how I could live. I spent the first few months fixing it up, painting the house a deep, rich blue because I could. I revived the old garden, mended fences, and cleaned up the barn. Every day was exhausting, but for the first time in my life, I felt satisfied. At the end of the day, I wasn't just existing anymore, I was living. Then came the letter. At first, I thought it as junk mail, one of those fake notices from a car warranty company or some scammer trying to get my information. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a violation notice from an HOA, which didn't make sense because I wasn't in an HOA. I skimmed the letter, and the absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. Apparently, I had committed several infractions. Unapproved paint color, lawn too tall, barn visibility from the street, unauthorized livestock ownership. The last one really got me. I had 2 goats. It wasn't like I was running a full-scale ranch. At the bottom of the letter was a threat written in bold, ominous font. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and possible legal action. I read it twice, trying to make sense of it. This had to be a mistake. There was no way this applied to me. So I did the only logical thing. I called them. That was my first mistake, because when I got Natalie, the HOA president, on the phone, I realized very quickly that this was no mistake, and she wasn't backing down. The letter sat on my kitchen table, taunting me. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. I wasn't an HOA. That was a fact. My property deed said so. The county record said so. Logic and basic common sense said so. But somehow, here I was holding a legal-looking document that said I was violating rules that didn't even apply to me. I figured this was just some clerical error, a simple misunderstanding. Maybe some overworked office worker had accidentally included my address in their database. I make a quick phone call, clear things up, and that would be the end of it. I had no idea I was about to walk into a battle. The HOA's number was printed at the bottom of the letter, so I dialed it, half expecting to get some bored receptionist who'd apologize for the mix-up. Instead, I got Natalie. Homeowners Association, this is Natalie speaking, came a clipped, professional voice. She sounded exactly like the kind of person who got drunk on making other people's lives miserable. Yeah, hi, I said, keeping my tone light. I just got a violation notice from your HOA, but I think there's been a mistake. My property isn't part of the HOA. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that made it clear she was already judging me. Our records indicate that your property falls within the HOA's jurisdiction, she said in a tone that suggested I was some kind of idiot for even questioning it. Well, that's funny, I replied, because my deed says otherwise. Another pause. Sir, she said, exhaling sharply like I was wasting her precious time, all properties in this area must adhere to HOA guidelines. I resisted the urge to laugh. That's great and all, but again, I'm not in your HOA. Sir, refusal to comply will result in escalating fines and possible legal action. It was then that I realized 2 things. 1, this wasn't a mistake. 2, Natalie was not going to back down. Well, Natalie, I said, keeping my voice deliberately cheerful, you go ahead and try, but I'm not paying a dime. I hung up before she could respond, feeling smug. That feeling lasted about 24 hours. The next day, I got another letter. This one wasn't just a violation notice, it was a fine. Apparently, since I hadn't corrected my infractions, I was now being charged $50 per day until I complied. By the end of the week, the fines had escalated to $100 per day, then $200. It was like some kind of extortion racket. At this point, I was both furious and slightly impressed. The HOA was relentless. Every day, I got another official-looking envelope in the mail, each one more aggressive than the last. I half expected one of them to contain a severed horse head. Still, I wasn't about to back down. But the real escalation came when they started showing up. One afternoon, I was repainting my fence when I saw a group of HOA board members standing at the edge of my property, 4 of them with clipboards in hand, muttering to each other and occasionally pointing at my house. I walked over, gripping the paintbrush like a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked, though what I really wanted to say was, "Are you lost?" One of them, a balding guy with tiny glasses, cleared his throat. "We're conducting a compliance check." "Compliance for what?" I asked, crossing my arms. "For the HOA regulations," he said matter-of-factly. I laughed right in his face. "I'm not in the HOA." He frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Our records say otherwise." "Well, your records are wrong." Another one, a woman with a sharp bob and the energy of someone who wrote Yelp reviews for fun, spoke up. "We've received multiple complaints from the community about your property." "Really?" I said, genuinely curious. "Who complained?" She hesitated. "We can't disclose that information." "Uh-huh. And what exactly is so offensive about my property?" She flipped through her clipboard dramatically. "Your barn is too visible from the road." "My barn?" "Yes," she said, nodding. "It disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood." "Histoire de hair." "It's a farm. That's what barns are for." The bald guy cleared his throat. "There's also the issue of your lawn." "What about it?" "It's too natural." I blinked. "Too natural?" He gestured vaguely at my yard. "It's not uniformly trimmed. The HOA requires all lawns to be cut to a maximum of 2 inches. I looked at my property. It's 10 acres. You want me to mow 10 acres of land down to exactly 2 inches? He nodded solemnly, like he had just delivered a royal decree. I took a deep breath. Okay, let's say hypothetically I was in the HOA, which I'm not. What exactly would happen if I just ignored all of this? The woman smirked. Non-compliance will result in escalating fines. If unpaid, a lien can be placed on your property. Eventually, it could be foreclosed upon. I exhaled slowly. You people are insane. She raised an eyebrow. So you're refusing to comply? I grinned. Oh, 100% refusing. That was the moment I officially became their enemy. The next week was hell. More letters, more fines, more board members snooping around. I started seeing mysterious cars parked near my property, just sitting there, watching. I tried attending an HOA meeting in person, thinking maybe I could reason with them. I was wrong. The moment I walked through the door, a security guard blocked my path. "You're not in good standing," he said. "I'm not even a member," I shot back. "Then you can't attend," he said, shrugging. At that point, it was war. If they wanted to act like I didn't exist, fine. I would make damn sure they couldn't ignore me. I built a sign, not some tiny yard sign, a massive 12-foot wide banner with bold black letters on a bright yellow background. It read, "This property is not part of the HOA. Stop sending false violations. Trespassers will be processed." I put it right at the entrance of my property, big enough for everyone to see. For a few days, silence. No new letters. No HOA goons lurking around. I thought maybe, just maybe, they had backed off. Then she showed up. Natalie. She pulled up in a shiny black SUV, stepped out in heels that were wildly impractical for a farmhouse, and stormed up to my fence. She had the same expression a middle school principal gets when they catch a kid chewing gum in class. "This is unacceptable," she snapped, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at my sign. "You need to take this down immediately." I crossed my arms. "No." She blinked like I had just spoken ancient Greek. "Excuse me." "Europa? Oh." "If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to escalate this matter legally." I leaned against my fence and grinned. "Go for it." She glared. "You'll regret this." Then she spun on her heel, marched back to her SUV, and sped off. I watched her taillights disappear. This wasn't over. I knew it. But if Natalie wanted a fight, she was about to get one. The first sign that Natalie wasn't bluffing came in the form of a certified letter, the kind where the mailman actually knocks on your door and makes you sign for it. That was never a good sign. I opened it right there on the porch. HOA legal action notice. The letter was dripping with legal jargon and threats. It accused me of malicious noncompliance, intentional property devaluation, and my personal favorite, failure to uphold community harmony. They were demanding I pay over $5,000 in accumulated fines, or they would begin the process of placing a lien on my property. I let out a slow breath, set the letter down, and laughed. Not a normal laugh, a full, unhinged, borderline villainous laugh. Because if they thought this was going to make me back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They wanted to go legal? Fine. I was about to get a lawyer. Hiring a lawyer. Enter Teresa, the HOA slayer. If you ever find yourself in a legal dispute with an HOA, you don't want a normal lawyer. You need someone who lives for this fight. Enter Teresa Carter, a property rights attorney in her late 50s, sharp as a knife and with the battle-hardened demeanor of someone who had spent decades crushing power-hungry HOA boards. I found her through a local legal forum where homeowners sang her praises. She destroyed my HOA in court. Teresa shut down my HOA's fraudulent violations. She's an HOA exterminator. I scheduled a meeting, walked in her office, and the moment she saw my case file, she let out a sharp, humorless chuckle. "Well," she said, flipping through my papers, "they've got some nerve." She pushed her glasses up her nose, tapped a finger on my property deed, then leaned back in her chair. "They have zero legal claim over your property," she said. "This is classic HOA scare tactics. They think you'll cave." I grinned. They clearly don't know me. She grinned back. "Good, because we're about to make them very uncomfortable." The first legal strike. Cease and desist. Teresa wasted no time. The very next day, she drafted a brutal, legally airtight cease and desist letter. It spelled out in clear, terrifying legal language that my property was not in the HOA. Any further fines, trespassing, or attempts to enforce HOA rules would be considered harassment. If they try to place a fraudulent lien, we would take them to court for damages. We overnighted the letter to the HOA board, and then we waited. A week passed. No response, no new letters. I started thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had decided to quietly retreat. Then I got a visit. A black sedan was parked just down the road from my driveway. A man sat inside, watching my property. When I stepped outside, he immediately pulled away. It wasn't a one-time thing. Every day, different cars showed up. They never stayed long, just watched. I knew what this was, intimidation. Then came the neighborhood whispers. I went into town to grab some supplies, and the atmosphere felt different. People who used to wave or nod at me suddenly looked away. Conversation stopped when I walked by. I overheard someone whisper my name. Natalie was poisoning the well. I didn't know what she was telling people, but it was working. Then one afternoon, while I was repairing a fence near the barn, two men in uniforms showed up. They had clipboards and were taking notes. "You walked over. Can I help you?" One of them, a tall guy in sunglasses, didn't even look up. "Routine inspection for what?" I laughed. "I'm not in the HOA." The shorter guy, who looked significantly more uncomfortable, shifted. "We were told to check." "Told by who?" I asked, crossing my arms. Silence. I stared at them. "You're trespassing." Still nothing. I took a step closer. "You have 30 seconds before I call the sheriff." That got their attention. The taller guy smirked, but they both turned and walked off. It wasn't over, not even close. A few days later, I was working in the barn when I heard sirens. I stepped outside just in time to see two police cruisers pulling into my driveway. Standing next to one of the officers was Natalie, her arms crossed, her face twisted into an expression of pure, rehearsed victimhood. I walked forward, keeping my voice calm. "Officers, what's going on?" One of the cops, a younger guy with his hand on his holster, gave me a hard stare. "We have reports of harassment, failure to comply with HOA regulations, and hostile behavior toward community members." I blinked. Natalie stepped forward, fake concern dripping from her voice. "We have documents proving his property falls under HOA jurisdiction. He's refusing to comply. Frankly, his behavior is becoming a danger to the community." A danger. I had barely spoken to anyone since moving in. The second officer, an older guy with more experience in dealing with nonsense, glanced at me. "Sir, do you have any proof your property isn't under the HOA. I kept my voice even. Yes, it's inside. I'll grab it. The younger cop tensed. Sir, step back slowly. I froze. I saw his posture, his stance. He wasn't just treating me like a suspect. He was ready to arrest me. This was bad. I moved slowly, carefully. I retrieved my property records and handed them over. The older cop flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with every page. After about a minute, he let out a long exhale. Well, damn. He turned toward Natalie. You want to explain this? She hesitated. I assumed. The cop cut her off. You assumed? You called in a false police report. She opened her mouth, then shut it. He flipped the folder closed and gave her a hard stare. You falsely reported a crime. That's a serious offense. The younger cop, who had been treating me like a criminal minutes ago, suddenly took a step back. The power shift was delicious. Natalie stammered. I just... Leave, the officer said, his tone final, or face trespassing charges. She swallowed hard, turned, and stormed her car. She didn't say another word, but before she drove off, she shot me a look, not anger, fear, because she knew she lost. And this was just the beginning. Natalie's SUV disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. But I knew this wasn't over. People like her never accepted defeat. I stood there for a moment, taking in what had just happened. The cops had seen through her lies, and the HOA's entire argument was now on shaky ground. But I also knew something else. She wasn't going to stop. If I was going to end this once and for all, I needed to go on the offensive. The gloves were coming off. That night, I called Teresa and gave her the full rundown. The fines, the intimidation tactics, the trespassing, the false police report, all of it. She was delighted. Oh, she said, voice practically purring over the phone. They screwed up. Yeah, they just crossed the line from annoying HOA into outright legal harassment. False police reports, trespassing. We have enough here to go after them for damages. I grinned. So what's next? We're going to play dirty, she said. She laid out the plan. File an official harassment complaint against the HOA with the county. Report Natalie's false police report to Internal Affairs. Get a judge to issue a restraining order against further HOA enforcement on my property. Notify the local press. The last part made me hesitate. Press? Absolutely, she said. I do hate bad publicity. Nothing makes them crumble faster than public outrage. Once the town hears how they try to steal land that wasn't theirs, Natalie's reign is over. I like the sound of that. The next morning, Teresa filed everything. By noon, the HOA had been served with a legal cease and desist order. It officially warned them to back off or face serious legal consequences. At the same time, I submitted my harassment complaint to the county office, and that's when the rumors started. Apparently, a few board members had no idea what Natalie had been doing. They thought I had been voluntarily ignoring HOA guidelines. Not that Natalie had been falsifying violations to take control of my property. By that evening, I got a message from Russell, one of the senior board members. Hey, can we talk? I wasn't sure what to expect, but I agreed. I walked into the HOA meeting that night, expecting more hostility. Instead, I saw chaos. Russell met me at the door. You need to hear this. Inside, board members were arguing loudly. Some were defending Natalie. Others were furious. Then, right in the center of it stood Natalie herself, looking pale and furious. She was losing control. The HOA board had finally seen the legal notices, the cease and desist, the police complaint, the harassment report, and they weren't happy. I didn't know we were threatening him with police action, one board member shouted. Why didn't we see this before fines were issued? Another snapped. Natalie's voice cut through the room like a whip. Because he was breaking the rules. Russell turned to her. What rules? You're not even in the HOA. Silence. Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. I watched as she looked around the room and realized for the first time she was outnumbered. Then Russell turned to me. We're voting, he said. Right now. I raised an eyebrow. On what? On removing Natalie from the HOA board. I smiled. About time. The vote was unanimous. Even the people who had blindly supported her turned their backs on her now. As Russell read out the final count, Natalie's perfectly composed mask cracked. This is a mistake, she hissed. No, Russell said, crossing his arms. The mistake was thinking you could lie, harass people, and abuse your position. You can't do this, she snapped. Oh, we absolutely can, he said. And as of now, you're no longer president of this HOA. Her face turned red, her hands balled into fists, and for a second, I actually thought she was going to throw something. Instead, she turned to me. This is your fault, she spat. You'll regret this. I just smiled. You already do. And with that, Natalie was done. Things moved fast after that. Within a week, the HOA dropped all fines and sent me a formal letter stating they had no jurisdiction over my land. Teresa filed one final lawsuit against them for damages and legal fees. By the time the dust settled, the HOA had completely changed. Russell, now the new president, actually wanted to fix things. We're cleaning house, he said. He stopped by my property a few days later. We hired a lawyer to go through all our documents. We want to undo some of the breaches from the last few years. I raised an eyebrow. And what do you want from me? We want your input. That made me pause. Why? Because, he said smirking, you fought back and you won. I hesitated. After everything, the last thing I wanted was to help the HOA. But if they were serious about fixing things, maybe it was worth giving them a push in the right direction. I crossed my arms. I'm not joining your board. Russell laughed. Didn't expect you to. I sighed. Fine, I'll give advice informally. He nodded. That's all we need. A few weeks later, Russell showed up again. We're having a neighborhood barbecue, he said. You should come. I almost said no. After everything that happened, I still wasn't sure if I wanted to be part of this community. But then he added, consider it a peace offering. So I went. And you know what? It wasn't bad. For the first time since moving in, I actually talked to my neighbor. The same people who had once avoided me out of fear were now laughing, drinking beer, and grilling burgers. And the irony of it all, after months of fighting the HOA, I was now helping make it better. Looking back, I realized something. I never wanted to be part of an HOA. I still didn't. But what I did want was a community, one that wasn't run by power-hungry tyrants like Natalie. And by fighting back, by refusing to let them bully me, I had somehow forced that change to happen. I had fought them. I had beaten them. And in the end, we all won.